Oh boy. Round 3. Hello everybody and welcome to the third episode of Drunk History with Graf. This is a series in which I drink some alcohol and talk about history, starting from the Bronze Age, going all the way up to present day. In this episode we're going to be starting at about the year 500 BC. And we're going to go on for... I'm actually not sure how long we're going to go on for. I aim to get most of the classical Greek period, but I might end up going a little farther, depending. Alrighty then. Last time we left off, the world looked something along the lines of this. This right here is actually an ethnic map of the world that I showed, so this is not any established states or empires, this is just the peoples that live there. This is what the world looks like in terms of states at this time. So, most of this episode is going to focus around one single civilization, that being the Greeks. Now, before I go any further, I have to establish something else. It's the exact same problem that we ran into last episode with the Persians, relating to modern perceptions of the country. Except this time, it is in reverse. So, to our modern eyes, this is Greece. But that was not true at all in the year 500 BC. In the year 500 BC, this was Greece. As you can see, it's quite a bit bigger. Like the Phoenicians at about the same sort of time, the Greeks spread out a lot and made a lot of colonies in various places, most of which haven't survived today, or if they have, they're definitely not Greek. So you had Greeks all over the place. Most notably, most of southern Italy was Greek. There was this little Greek colony in what's now Marseille. All across the inside of the Black Sea, there was Greek trading ports all around there, even though the interiors of those countries were not Greek at all. And most crucially for the events of this episode, Anatolia is partially Greek. A lot of the west coast of Anatolia is inhabited mostly by Greeks. So, how did it come to be this way? Last time we looked at this part of the world, it had fallen into a complete dark age. It had, after a massive collapse of monumental proportions, one that we've actually never seen since. Well, that was 500, more like 700 years ago by this point. So, 700 years is just about enough time to recover, but a lot changes in 700 years. Culture changes, religion changes, language changes, and the states that are involved change. So, ever since the Bronze Age collapsed, most of the big, important Mycenaean centers of civilization have been replaced by new Hellenistic ones. So, this is the Greek homeland, as we're going to call it, which is modern Greece, with all of the big, important cities that we know from the time period. So, all of the big giants, Sparta, Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, Argos, all of these are going to be important players. But at this time, by far and away, the biggest power is Sparta. The reasons for which I'm going to explain a little bit later. Sparta is an absolute aberration among Greek states. It's a very different kind of place from most of them. Most Greek states were a sort of a very ordinary sort of deal in which the central government would just sort of run the laws and the majority of people would be farmers, and they'd have a small aristocracy that would do the running of the government. Sparta was completely different in that in order to be a citizen of Sparta, you had to be a warrior in the absolutist sense. So the Spartans were a military elite that ruled over a bunch of non-Spartan citizens. Spartan society was stratified into 3 main groups. I'm going to refer to them in their Greek names, so bear with me. The first is the homoioi, meaning the Spartiates, and these are Spartan citizens. A homoioi male, when born, is inspected by an elder for defects or problems, i.e. if you're lame, if you have a gimpy leg or something, or if you have a scar, birthmark in a weird place, any superstitious reason, then this child would be cast out into the wilds, basically, and left to fend for themselves, where they would invariably die. When these kids grew to be 8 years old, they would be transferred to a special state-run school known as the Agoge, where they were trained in the ways of war, and Well, I don't think there's any better way to put this, but if any of you are veterans, if any of you have gone through basic training or any equivalent of that, in which your sergeant shouts at you and gets you to do stupid shit and gets you to run around in a circle and any fuck up learns you 10 push-ups, that has nothing on the Agoge, because it was fairly common that Spartan kids would die during the Agoge if they weren't up to it. And this was intended to weed out all of the weak ones so that only the strongest people would be Spartan citizens. And these Spartan citizens, having graduated from the Agoge, would have only one career path: soldiers in the Spartan army. The second group were the Periakoi, who were the assorted merchants and various craftsmen who did a lot of the... they were the middle class, essentially. They did a lot of the not heavy lifting jobs that were not soldiering. So, building weapons, crafting things, tools, whatever, tailoring, all that kind of stuff, was all counted under the Periakoi. And then, at the bottom, the Helots, who were no fucking frills attached slaves. Most of slaves were captured in war, prisoners of war, criminals, or just people who were born into the system, because ancient times. Also, the Spartan political system is often misrepresented. So, Sparta is actually one of the first countries to have a pretty serious attempt at making separation of power, which is a very big thing in modern day. In a modern day Western democratic government, you have 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Now, they didn't have that in Sparta, but what they did have was something called the dual monarchy, in which they had 2 kings from 2 separate royal houses. And each king held a veto over the other. So if one king decided to do something stupid or that would only benefit him but not anybody else, the other king would veto them. Additionally, there was also a big aristocratic chamber which dealt with most of the running of government day to day, whereas the kings tended to mostly just be the heads of the army. Due to this unique system in which the Spartan citizenry was trained from birth to be warriors, they had a comparatively massive and extremely well-trained warrior class, which meant that Sparta was an absolute diplomatic and military heavyweight in the Greek world. You didn't fuck with Sparta. You just didn't. You just didn't. You would lose. Next, I'm going to move back over to the other main player in this story, Persia. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, Persian imperialism was kind of different to most other imperialisms in that it was intended to put on a happy face. It was a much more soft-spoken kind of thing. Certainly, if you watch 300, they will portray the Persian Empire as an extremely evil empire that conquered, enslaved, and destroyed everything that it could. This is absolutely not true, and I also have to point out, with regarding our sources in this, you see, this was the point when dedicated history had just been invented by a Greek guy called Herodotus. He's the first guy to have wrote what we modern day consider to be professional history. However, the thing about Herodotus is that he, like most historians, have an agenda. And Herodotus, bless his little heart, was, well, he believed in basically pan-Greekism, pan-Hellenism. He wanted the Greek-speaking world to be much more united rather than fragmented into different city-states in order to help resist the Persians. And so in order to do this, he essentially manufactured an excessively evil Persia in order to try and encourage Greek states to band together to fight it. So, yes, Persia in this story does attempt to invade Greece, but don't trust 300 for everything. The 300 is not a historical source. It's not even a fully historical film because it's based on a graphic novel rather than the actual events. That said, it does get some things right, and I will touch on those when we come to them. Basically, what Persia did was it ran off something called a tribute system. Now, a variety of empires throughout history had this. It's certainly a lot more common back then than it is now. What the Persian tradition would be was that they would turn up at an area with their massive army, show off their wealth, flex the muscles a little bit, and go up to the king of the area and say, "Earth and water, give me them, show me your submissiveness, and I will leave you be," essentially. The Persians demanded subservience to themselves in symbolism only, basically. The Persian title, the one that at this point is held by Cyrus, is Shahanshah, meaning King of Kings, or Shah of Shahs. And this is meant to essentially represent how every single other king that was within the Persian sphere of influence owed their fealty to him, even though they maintained their title as king. So he was king of a class of kings. That's what it's intended to be. Persian religion at this time was something called Zoroastrianism, which is one of the older monotheistic religions alongside Judaism, and the Persians believed in this. But big important thing is they generally tended not to force it on their subjects, unlike a lot of empires in the future which would attempt to try and create citizens of that empire with religion or with culture or with language. The Persians had a very, very light touch. A tributary kingdom, or a kingdom in which Persia dominated, would send some earth and some water and some money to Persia, and that was it. Aside from that, the king was basically allowed to run the country as he liked, within reason. I.e., no eugenics warrior state, for example. So at this time, most Greek states were oligarchies and aristocracies dominated by a monarch. This was all about to change when a tiny backwater city-state called Athens had a coup and exiled their monarch. And what they instead replaced it with was a democratic system in which all of the citizens could come to a single location to vote on laws, on actions, not elected representatives. It was not democracy as we know it. I have to make that clear. Athens contrasts quite significantly with Sparta, because the average Spartan got influence on the basis of the fact that he was a soldier, and therefore he had strength. And he could then lord it over every other non-Spartan in Sparta who was not a soldier. So all of the Perioikoi and Helots could be bullied by any Spartan. In Athens, this was not the case. And in Athens, after this coup had replaced their king with a democratic body, an Athenian citizen would be able to go to this assembly and vote on courses of action. But it should be noted that both of these states had massive slave populations. I think it was about 30 or 40% of the Athenian population could vote, and about 20% of the Spartan population were Spartan citizens. The rest of them were either slaves or Perioikoi. So Athens goes and exiles their king, and this king ends up fleeing to Persia. Now, as I mentioned, the Persian title of their king was King of Kings. So essentially what the exiled king decided that he was going to do was he was going to try and get the Persians to try and put him back on the throne, under the condition that he gave them the earth and water that they wanted. And the Persians were kind of skeptical of this. They weren't really willing to give it the time of day. But then another event happened which completely changed their minds. See, Athens had just gone and declared themselves a democracy, but they were outside of the Persian Empire, and so the Persians didn't give a fuck. Doesn't matter. But in Anatolia, not Turkey, it isn't Turkey yet, there aren't any Turks there. In Anatolia, a bunch of Greek city-states that are under the Persian domination, whose kings have submitted to Persia, suddenly do the same, and they exile their kings as well and declare themselves democracies. And Athens funds them, sends arms and armour to them, as well as money to go and fight their revolution. And the Persian army comes down hard on them. And this ends up going quite badly for these revolting cities, and they end up getting crushed. Now, the mighty Persian giant has been roused and is angry. At this point, the ruler of Persia is a man called Darius. Cyrus is long dead by this point, and Darius is now in charge. So Darius basically makes a promise that Athens will burn for doing this, for supporting these revolutions. And this is just about where Athens starts actually getting recognition, because before this they were a backwater. But suddenly they're important because they're now exporting the ideology of proto-democracy to the world. But before Darius can do anything about this, he figures that he's got to do something about some northern raiders, the Scyths. Now, no, not those Scyth. A different Scyth. That Scyth, thank you. The Scyths were a bunch of nomadic horse tribes that lived in a massive area, actually. I have to take a moment to talk about the Scyths. What's actually happening here isn't all that important, but I'm a massive Scyth fanboy, so I have to talk about them. The Scyths were at the time, an extremely powerful force. They were essentially, the best way to describe the Scyths are white Mongols. They were very similar in their lifestyle and very similar in their warfare. They were mounted archers who could ride rings around ordinary armies. It is written by, I can't remember if it's Herodotus or if it's Xenophon, that the Scyths are considered to be a greater foe than any other, that they are the most powerful force in the ancient world. This is kind of up in the air, as they don't actually do a lot of warring with the Greeks. It happens occasionally, but mostly not. I personally don't think that they would have had a lot of luck against the Greeks, just due to the very specific fighting styles. So now I'm going to go back to our good old friend from last episode, the Meta of War Graf. Now, this is very strange, because in this instance, these groups actually differ quite significantly, based on geography. In the 800s BC, the Persians had been a nomadic horse tribe, and they had fought on horseback with archers. Now, by the time of 500 BC and 300 intervening years, they had settled down and become a sedentary civilization, but they maintained a proud cavalry tradition. Their way of war involved encircling the enemy with fast-moving cavalry attacks. So, the meta of warfare, according to the Persians, looks something like this. And they had defeated the Medes, who were mostly an infantry-based civilization. However, their infantry was honestly not that good, based on what I've seen. And after this, then Medes would make up the vast majority of Persian infantry. The Scyths also had a very massive emphasis on cavalry, for obvious reasons. So their graph looks something like this. As you can see, they didn't believe at all in artillery or cannon. In Greece, this was never going to work. The meta in Greece was very heavily stacked in favour of infantry, because they developed something called the phalanx, which you might have heard of. And the phalanx was essentially a bunch of guys with shields and spears, arranged such that the shields would overlap and cover, meanwhile the spears would go over the top. Now, these were designed for warfare between Greek states, in which both combatants would wield the same kind of armies, with the same kind of weapons and the same kind of tactics. And they'd form a shield wall and bustle against each other and stab at each other, with very little actual casualties, but the first side that broke and ran away would be the side that lost. Against non-Greeks, however, this was devastatingly effective, and produced huge amounts of casualties. Now, one of the main reasons for this is that Greece is an extremely mountainous country, and mountains is one of the types of area which really heavily favour infantry over other types, especially over cavalry. Cavalry is near useless in the mountains, because in order to effectively make use of cavalry, you have to use their speed and mobility to move around and to get into places where the infantry don't expect them. But in the mountains, the area in which you can actually put a person, much less a person on horseback, is much smaller. So the much more numerically superior infantry can simply block a choke point. And this is going to become important shortly. Median infantry was considerably inferior. While Greek shields were made out of hardwood and furnished with bronze, Mede shields were made out of wickerwork. And maybe they would resist an arrow or two, they would not resist a heavily thrust spear. Going back to the Spartans, actually, this is one of the reasons why they were the absolute juggernaut of the Greek world, was because Greek warfare, into Greek warfare that is, relied heavily on morale, rather than on actual fighting power. So quality beat out quantity in every single battle, and the highly trained, highly disciplined, highly motivated Spartans would demolish any other army. because they would just keep going until the other army ran out of confidence. Quite to the contrast, if the Persians were to try and attack a hoplite line, usually they would do so with arrows, which would be completely ineffective because the Greeks had these massive hoplon shields, which were, as I said, made out of hard wood and furnished in bronze, which made them extremely tough. And they were designed to be overlapping, which meant that they were extremely difficult to get away past. And even then, the Greeks were one of the few civilizations that believed quite heavily in this time in armour. Some Greek states more than others. Athens didn't tend to believe in a whole lot of armour. They tend to put helmets, occasionally greaves. The Spartans, on the other hand, they were heavy bronze infantry with full-on chest plates, which made them extremely tough. Oh crap, look at the time. Looks like I'm only going to have time for one battle. So, Darius wraps up his campaign with the Scyths, which I can't remember how it goes. I don't think it goes particularly well for the Persians. And he puts together an army which he goes to go and invade Greece and burn Athens. There's another city, I think it was Eritrea, which also joined in, which got completely burned to the ground. Everyone inside sold into slavery. Now, the Persian navy goes and lands a massive force about 24 miles north of Athens, at a little bay called Marathon. The Athenian army rushes up there and deploys itself in position. The Athenian army is massively outnumbered by the Persians, especially the Persian cavalry, which, if it unleashed, would almost certainly encircle and defeat them. But the Greeks also have a very good position encamped up by the tree line, which means that the Persians are unwilling to challenge them immediately until they're ready. This means that there's an uneasy stalemate brought in which neither side is willing to press the attack. Athens knows that it's outnumbered and is likely fucked. Athens decides to send a messenger to Sparta for reinforcements. Now, Sparta really doesn't like Athens because this democracy that they're sending out is an established challenge to the Spartan way of life, and it's especially attractive to Sparta's massive Hilot population, which are likely to start an uprising. But Sparta also really doesn't like the Persians because they are an existential threat militarily. So the Spartans are thinking of helping them. However, they're in the middle of a religious festival, and the Spartans refuse to march to war and anger the gods, because it was considered that it would likely bring ruin to Sparta. This was a very religious society in which people were extremely superstitious and extremely worried about how they appeared to the gods, because unlike in most modern religions, the Greeks believed that the Greek gods might actually go and intervene and change things, which according to Homer's Iliad, happened. It didn't happen, but the Greeks thought it might. Back to Marathon, almost a week passes and neither army makes a move. But eventually, the Persians make a move by sending their cavalry to go and forage for food. This is a bad move as the Athenians take this opportunity to attack the weak Median infantry. As I mentioned, Greek infantry is vastly superior to Mede infantry, and the Medes end up being pushed back into the sea. The Persian army re-embarks their ships and sails southwards, realizing that maybe, if they can just maybe get to Athens first while it's undefended, they could sack it and set it on fire before the army gets there. The Athenian army realizes what's about to go down, and they attempt to rush back to Athens. And in the process of doing so, they run a marathon. And yes, this is where marathon in marathon race comes from, is that it's the distance between Athens and Marathon. The legend goes is that after the battle was won, Athens sent back a runner to their city to try and convince the political establishment not to surrender to Persia preemptively because they'd just won the battle. And as soon as this messenger gets there and delivers his message, dies of exhaustion. Most likely apocryphal, but nevertheless. After this 24-mile forced march, the Athenian army reaches back to their city and sets up on the walls, just in time to see the Persian navy sail into place. There is no second clash. The Persians, seeing the Athenians have manned their posts and the city's defended, go home. Wow, we have not been able to go over a lot this episode. Might be because I'm a little drunker than usual. Nevertheless, looks like that's where we're going to wrap things up today. Alright, in the next episode, we're going to talk about the famous Battle of Thermopylae, the rest of the Persian War, and the aftermath of it on Greek civilization. and possibly some other stuff. This has been Graf. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.